Thank you, Gary. So our final speaker this afternoon is Dr. Nancy Roth. Nancy Roth is senior lecturer at the University College of Falmouth. She earned a PhD at the City University of New York in 1996 with a dissertation on the German photomontage artist John Hartfield. She has a long-term interest in the tensions and attractions between artists and writing, between images and texts, which has led her to the work of Vilem Flusser. In the past decade, she has become an enthusiastic reader and translator of his writings, viewing them as a historical and theoretical context in which writing and image shape different, potentially antagonistic forms of consciousness. She has also completed a translation of one of his books into the universe of technical images from German into English.
Thank you. I should check this. Is that okay? Thank you, Tanya. And thanks to all of you for your patience. I hope your energy isn't flagging. For some 20 years, between the early 1950s and the early 1970s, Vilem Flusser and his wife Edith regularly hosted lively, informal gatherings, somewhere between social events and seminars, as I imagine them, on the terrace of their apartment in Sao Paulo. The Flussers had come to Brazil in 1940. Both natives of Prague, they had understood the kind of danger they were in as Jews in a Nazi-occupied city, although he had been unable to convince his friends and family of that danger. On his arrival in Brazil, he learned that his father had been killed, and more such news followed until he'd lost everything that had counted as home. A period of severe depression followed, but Vilem and Edith married. They learned Portuguese, they had children. He began to write in newspapers and magazines, and later to teach, eventually becoming a professor in the philosophy of science first, and then in communicology, which was the name he gave his own theory of communication. He sought out conversation partners. He and Edith turned their terrace, which overlooked the city, into a place where people could meet and talk. He later distinguished between two groups of people that came to their home to talk, whether about science, history, philosophy, literature, technology, theology, media, art, music, education, or politics. There were always many young people, he said, who came and went relatively quickly, and whose broad interests and beliefs changed dramatically over the years. There was also a small group, core group of people he designated adults, whose views were relatively stable. Among the core group, the adults, was the artist Mira Schendel. I'm grateful to the Tate, specifically to Tanya Barson, for the invitation to speak today for any number of reasons, but not least because in preparing the remarks, I think I've gained a much clearer idea of the way Flusser thought about art. I teach art students, have formal education in art history, and have long lived with the tension between studio work and writing that persists on studio art courses. Among my first and strongest attractions to Flusser's thought was his acknowledgement of an unbridgeable difference, in fact an antagonism, between writing and image making. Or more exactly, between the forms of consciousness that characterize each one. He acknowledged, that is, what I'd only sensed, that is, and went on to confirm how much it mattered. But I've found Flusser's understanding of art much more difficult to grasp, even to find. The term appears frequently, but briefly in a very wide variety of settings. In the past 2 weeks, given the occasion to look as closely as I could at connections between Flusser and Schendel, I've learned more, but perhaps more importantly, have become convinced that Flusser's understanding of art took shape in dialogue with Schendel. Through her work and in their verbal exchanges, all those afternoons, I'm imagining, on the terrace in Sao Paulo, Schendel articulated a way of being in the world that Flusser recognized as being completely different from his own, yet equally intelligent, engaged, open, free of guile or deceit. She seems to have embodied, for him, the way an artist is or could be. Before going any further, I need to say a little more about the way Flusser understands dialogue. When he talks about it, dialogue is invariably paired with discourse. Discourse is for preserving and distributing information. I tend to think of print or broadcast news, reference books of the law, information that has established value and that moves pretty much in one direction. It tends to radiate out from a center. By contrast, dialogue, and only dialogue, is creative. It must be free, open, between equal partners. It doesn't always have to be between two people. It can be between two parts of one person's memory, and that's the model of the solitary genius creator, or between an organic and an artificial memory, that is, between a person and a book or a library or website, or a natural phenomenon. He likes the example of Isaac Newton having the laws of celestial mechanics in his mind and seeing an apple fall, and the spark becomes the theory of gravitational forces. But the most thrilling, expansive dialogues occur between living human memories. Any society needs both discourse and dialogue. That is, one to create new information, one to preserve and distribute it. But the balance can go wrong. He feared, as you can probably imagine at this point, that the overwhelming power of discursive forces in contemporary society were reducing genuine dialogue to a point of extinction. For Flusser to call an exchange a dialogue, then, in short, is to assign it a very high value. Clearly, there was a dialogue between Flusser and Schendel, one that lasted many years. Flusser's autobiography, entitled Bodenlos, which means roughly without foundation or homeless, contains a short essay, it's about 5 printed pages, entitled Mira Schendel. It's one in a series called Dialogues, each describing a unique creative exchange that Flusser had with a particular person. The text seems to have been written about 1973 in Europe, when he had left Brazil. As he begins to look back on his time in Brazil, it wasn't published for many years, not until 1992 in German. The essay Mira Schendel distills 2 key points from the extended dialogue. They are transparency and meaning. And I'm going to read some quotes. They're my translation, and please bear with me. I don't think they're easy either. He begins with transparency. Transparency is the result of a capacity of human vision to penetrate through the surface of things. Vision can penetrate through the surface into the depth of things in either a disciplined or an intuitive way. And that word intuitive is a tricky translation, and we can come back to that, but that seems the best for now. A disciplined or an intuitive way. And it is this depth that gives human beings the experience of a life world. I mentioned 2 ways of making things transparent, the disciplined and the intuitive. In the first one, for example, in the methods of scientific discourse, penetrating, searching vision uncovers increasingly abstract, formal, empty backgrounds, against which those things visible to naive vision move back and forth as if they were just surfaces. In the second method of making things transparent, for example, in mystical, phenomenological, or artistic observation, voids appear abruptly behind the surfaces, and the look encounters no objects, only nothingness. Now, the discipline method is progressive in the sense that it moves from a formal to an even more formal background, from empty to even emptier. Today, it is about to discover, by discipline methods, the same voids that the intuitive method supposed were there all along. At this point, there will be no more objects in our life world. We are surrounded by transparent structures, through which we in fact see nothing, only endless rows of more transparent structures, and this in all directions. Even inwards, we have become transparent even to ourselves. The result of this, the world's being without objects, is that we ourselves are somehow not there. For to be there, to exist, means to be in a world of objects. There can be no subject without an object. That is the problem of transparency in my dialogues with Mira. Okay, that's end of the quote for now. The philosophical language begins abruptly. No introduction to this talk of objects, subjects, existence. No warning about his highly metaphorical use of the word transparency, or the quick reference to scientific thought with the single adjective disciplined, or the contrast between it and the three immediate approaches, mystical, phenomenological, and artistic. There is a hyperbolic atmosphere throughout the passage that would warn the wise against any attempt to clarify or simplify, but fools rush in. I think he might just be saying that we can see through everything nowadays, or almost everything, and it's probably the sciences, physics, astronomy, and neuroscience, that had the most to do with it. We look through things and see more transparent things. Again, metaphorically speaking. There's no background, nothing behind it all, and so no meaning. It's the same conclusion, he suggests, that many mystics, phenomenologists, and artists reached long ago. Meaning is what symbols, I'm quoting again here. Meaning is what symbols refer to. Symbols are consciously or unconsciously conventionalized things that represent other things. In fact, that represent those things available to the conventions, or codes, he says. For those who can decode the symbols, the things the symbols represent is their meaning. To make symbols, then, would be to give the concrete things of the world new meaning. But when the entire world has become transparent, that is to say that it is not concrete, then everything is symbolic, and no symbol has any final meaning anymore. Everything means everything, which is essentially to say it means nothing at all. Flusser then describes two of Schendel's works, and I have not even attempted to reproduce them here because I don't really know which they are. He did not give titles, and maybe you'll be able to recognize from the same information I had, which is written. The first consists of two transparent sheets of acrylic bound together, the whole suspended from the ceiling so that it can move freely. Between the plastic sheets are overlapping pieces of very thin, he calls them transparent, rice paper. The paper and the inner and outer surfaces of the plastic have been inscribed with various kinds of signs, letters and numbers. Okay, I'm quoting again here. Since it is all perfectly transparent, the observer is looking at a text through which he can see the room. And because the sheet swings easily with any air movement, the observer sees a text that changes constantly in space, in its context. The text offers itself to the observer from two sides, the two surfaces of the hanging sheet. Of course, it is the same text seen from two sides, but the one is not only the mirror image of the other, but the various layers appear in reverse order. These signs take on a particular form depending on the angle at which the observer is looking, that is, as traditional lines, as vertical lines, as diagonal lines, and as lines in a third dimension. Many of these forms yield words and sentences in various languages, giving the impression that one has somehow formed these words and sentences oneself. Others yield images of scenes, such as that of a swarm of bees consisting of A, or an army of bees on the march. Still others yield geometric formations, spirals, for example. The overall impression is one of a completely meaningless text, decipherable at any point on which one focuses attention. In this sense, the sheet is a map of the world as it currently presents itself in its transparency and ultimate meaninglessness to human beings. All the while, the work is making a clear aesthetic impression. It fascinates and demands continual decoding, to say nothing of its decorative function in the room. Despite transparency, the sheet dominates its entire environment. Another of Mira's works is a notebook, about 30 by 20 centimeters in size. It is one of a series of notebooks that differ from one another in format and theme, but the series forms a unity, one might say a library of the future. The topic of the notebook I have chosen is B. This letter appears on most of the pages of the notebook, either alone, somewhere on the page, or touching the inner or outer edge of a circle. But there are also pages that contain only circles, as well as empty pages. The crucial thing about the text is that it appears to turn not only in a third, but also in a fourth dimension. For the B not only changes abruptly into D, but also into P and Q in a way that can be seen but not actually understood, since it continues to be a shock each time it happens. One gets the feeling of facing something that is mysterious in its simplicity and has a sense of obligation to absorb it. And that is probably the mark of genuine art. Okay, close that quote for now. He goes on to say when and where the works were shown, and to note that Mira had given him both of them. A reader gets the impression that he might be looking at them as he writes. We have before us an attempt to present thought constructions, that is, concepts, to us as images, to make them imaginable. To say it concretely, Mira tries to translate the concept of transparency and the concept of meaning into a realization, and I'm thinking maybe performance might be a way to say this as well, performance of transparency and a realization of meaning. That is an inversion of the traditional function of imagine and understand. Traditionally, thinking goes something like this. I encounter something concrete. I form an image of this concrete thing. I imagine it so as to acquaint myself with it. And then I translate my image into a concept so as to understand the concrete thing and then be able to handle it. Historically, the phase of imagining is the mythical, magical one, and the phase of understanding is the epistemological, technical one. In fact, this briefly describes the structure of Western civilization. It doesn't stay small, ever. With Mira, it comes to a qualitative reversal. She starts from the concept and tries to imagine it. She uses her imaginative powers to make the world of ideas concrete, rather than to grasp the world of concrete things, for this world slips through our fingers. One aspect of the contemporary world of ideas is that it has become unimaginable. This has a great deal to do with our alienation. We cannot imagine what our ideas, for example, scientific ideas, imply. A new kind of imaginative power is required to do it, and Mira mobilizes this new power for us. Okay, close quote. In very tightly condensed form, Flusser is aligning Schendel's work in his own history of communication, the project that absorbed his attention for most of his life. He spells out this history more fully elsewhere, particularly in Into the Universe of Technical Images. And I'd like to say a little more about it here because it underpins what he's saying about Schendel's work. At the heart of the matter is an irreconcilable difference between the kind of consciousness that interacts with the world by way of images and the kind that relies primarily on alphanumeric linear text, writing. The invention of writing changed human consciousness, introduced a new historical universe in which events occur, have causes and effects, where time proceeds in a linear way in one direction. It is the form of consciousness responsible, and I quote here, for most of what we treasure about the Western inheritance, close quote, and also for endless violence and pain. A consciousness that is, he finally concludes, murderous and mad. That's also a quote. And it is, he believes, now coming to an end. At the very beginning of the book, Does Writing Have a Future?, written in 1987, so well after he was in Brazil, he expresses a belief that writing is becoming an esoteric skill, surpassed at every turn by technical images, and that term includes photography, film, sound reproduction, digital sound and image synthesis. It's a whole range of technologies. Flusser's history of communication, then, moves from the magical consciousness of prehistory, dominated by images, through some 5 centuries of historical consciousness dominated by writing and characterized by conceptual thought. At the moment he's writing about Mira Schendel, he was seeing a reemergence of the power of images, although on new terms. And in Schendel, he's recognizing someone who was translating, and he does use this word, across another huge gap, from elaborate, unimaginable philosophical and historical concepts into perceptible images. Flusser acknowledged at the outset that Schendel was a person of great emotional volatility. She, and I quote, demanded a patience that I do not actually possess. But he continues, I was patient nevertheless for Mira because, for among other reasons, I admired in her a great artist, the greatest of my acquaintance. He goes on to say that in the exchange between them, it was always Mira who controlled the dialogue, and that the subject was always Mira's work, and that the dialogue was extraordinarily productive. He credits himself with having been her genuine critic, which is to say he had an effect on her work. And he's very quick to credit her with having affected him as well. In this very short essay, then, it seems possible to detect flashes of exasperation, pride, gratitude, admiration, but I'd like to say, above all, a sense that Mira Schendel, this person, and above all, this dialogue, was essential to have in his own autobiographical record. Thinking forward to the books Flusser would write after he left Brazil, it seems possible to detect Mira's presence in forming a persistently unorthodox understanding of art, as well as a firm conviction about the creative powers of dialogue. For Flusser is often very dismissive of art in its most familiar framings. He refers to the ridiculous isolation of an avant-garde in Communicology. It's nearly his last book. At one point. And in another point, he insists that the concept of art actually blocks our understanding of new imagery often. And he's talking particularly about computer imagery. Yet he also wrote, more than once, that we could die from a lack of art, and spoke of the committed artistic life with a consistent reverence that seems to me to approach awe. Flusser does not always use terms consistently. In this case, it seems clear that the same word, art, is functioning in very different ways. One possibly referring to a past and familiar use, the other new and rather forbidding. And I think it is probably fair to suggest that the way he grasps art in his friend's work as the project of translating unimaginable concepts into imaginable things is fairly forbidding. There can be no doubt in any case that he understood the dialogue between himself and Mira Schendel to have been immensely creative. Among Flusser's best-known essays is one called Exile and Creativity, in which he presents, quote again, a positive assessment of expulsion, unquote. Exile in this essay is conceived broadly. it extends to include, say, the expulsion of the old from the world of the young, or of humanists from the universe of technical images, as well as the expulsion of a citizen from a nation or culture. Flusser describes creativity, here as elsewhere, in terms of information processing, the processing of existing information to produce new, discarding the redundant and treasuring the informative. That is the new. Those who stay at home recognize change as informative, but permanence as redundant. Exile is different. Quoting again, in exile, everything is unusual. Exile is an ocean of chaotic information. In it, the lack of redundancy does not allow the flood of information to be received as meaningful messages. Because it is unusual, exile is unlivable. One must transform the information whizzing around into meaningful messages to make it livable. One must process the data. It is a question of survival. Data transformation is a synonym for creation. The expelled must be creative. The respective circumstances in which the Flussers and Mira Schendel became permanent residents of Brazil, far from their places of birth, from their families, from facilitating connections, were not the same. And yet, it seems to me likely that they shared a sense of Bodenlosigkeit, homelessness or foundationlessness, that sense of being rootless that Flusser came to associate with a rare freedom. The advent of the expelled in exile leads to external dialogues. An industrious creative activity arises spontaneously in the vicinity of the expelled. He is a catalyst for the synthesis of new information. If he becomes aware of his uprootedness as his own sense of self, then an internal dialogue begins within himself, which is to say, an exchange between the information he has brought with him and an entire ocean with waves of information that crash around him in exile. The objective is the creation of meaning between the imported information and the chaos that surrounds him. If these internal and external dialogues are harmonized with each other, they transform in a creative manner not only the world, but also the original natives and the expelled. This is what I meant when I said what freedom means for the expelled, the freedom to remain a stranger, different from the others. It is a freedom to change oneself as well as others. I imagine many sunny afternoons on a terrace in Sao Paulo, Flusser and Schendel working through misunderstandings and confusions, the occasional explosion, with moments of tremendous excitement and discovery, both seeing double in the sense of old and new together, a sense of loss and a sense of release from their European educations and experiences, both eager for a glimpse of the future. Thank you.